In the heart of Beverly Hills, where opulence reigned supreme and the glitter of wealth was never far from sight, Shaquille O'Neal stepped into La Lumiere, a renowned restaurant known for its elegance and sophistication. The sleek marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, and the air was filled with the subtle murmur of wealthy patrons engaged in hushed conversations. The walls were adorned with contemporary art, and the tables were set with impeccable precision, each piece of silverware gleaming as though polished for the gods themselves. Shaquille, dressed in casual attire, his simple gray t-shirt, worn-out sneakers, and faded jeans, seemed almost out of place among the sea of designer suits and evening gowns that surrounded him. The contrast was glaring. Outside, the parking lot was filled with gleaming sports cars, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Rolls-Royces, their polished exteriors reflecting the warm glow of the evening sun. Inside, the ambiance screamed luxury, each detail calculated to exude wealth and exclusivity. Yet Shaquille, towering over the patrons with his familiar 7-foot frame, appeared unaffected by the lavish surroundings. His entrance was almost unnoticed, as though he was a man who didn't seek attention despite the very nature of his presence. Choosing a small, discreet table tucked away near the far corner of the restaurant, Shaquille settled into the plush seat. The subtle rustle of fine silk, the clink of wine glasses, and the quiet murmur of conversation filled the air. Shaquille's eyes scanned the menu briefly, though he wasn't particularly hungry. It wasn't the food that had brought him to La Lumiere. Instead, it was the quietude of the place, a break from the constant public gaze that followed him everywhere. As the staff moved effortlessly between tables, he leaned back in his chair, a hint of a smile on his lips as he relaxed. Despite the lavish surroundings, there was something almost invisible about him here. His casual attire allowed him to blend in, to become just another anonymous figure in a room full of the elite. No one knew him here, at least not yet. But in a place like La Lumiere, no one is ever really anonymous. Before Shaquille could even glance at the wine list, a young waitress approached him. She was tall, with straight blonde hair and sharp features that seemed perpetually locked in an expression of disdain. Her uniform was pristine, and her heels clicked confidently against the marble floor as she made her way toward the table. Her name tag read Emma. She paused for a moment as she looked down at him, her eyes narrowing as she took in his attire. Her gaze lingered on his worn sneakers, a small sneer curling on her lips. With the kind of arrogance that only someone with little regard for decorum could muster, she crossed her arms and leaned in slightly, her voice carrying just a little too loudly for comfort. "Are you sure you can afford to dine here?" she sneered, her words sharp and pointed, slicing through the murmur of the restaurant. The tone of her voice was unmistakable, condescending and accusatory, as if she had already decided what kind of man Shaquille was based solely on his appearance. Her words hung in the air, heavy with judgment. Patrons at nearby tables turned their heads, their eyes darting over to the exchange, intrigued by the unexpected confrontation. Shaquille paused. A moment of tension passed. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath as the noise around them seemed to fade into the background. Shaquille, unfazed by the attack, looked up at Emma with a calmness that radiated from him like a quiet storm. His eyes met hers, but there was no anger in them. Instead, there was an unmistakable amusement, the kind you'd see when a man who had seen it all took note of an inconvenience, but not one worth his time. Emma's smile faltered slightly as Shaquille stood up, his towering height now fully apparent. The patrons around them watched, captivated by what would happen next. It was as though the air had thickened with the anticipation of a spectacle. Shaquille didn't respond with harsh words. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black card, the kind of card that few had ever seen, let alone held. Without a word, he handed it to Emma, who hesitated for a fraction of a second before accepting it. Her eyes widened as she glanced down at the card, and her jaw tightened. The truth of who he was hit her in that moment. The Shaquille O'Neal, the former NBA legend, the mogul, the man whose fortune far surpassed the sum of all the luxuries in the room. But what came next would leave everyone in the restaurant stunned. Shaquille leaned back in his chair, a quiet smile still on his lips, but it wasn't one of amusement anymore. It was the smile of a man who had learned the cost of underestimating others. He said simply, "I'm not here for the recognition, Emma, but maybe it's time you learned not to judge a book by its cover." As Emma stood frozen, processing the encounter, the quiet murmur of the room began to rise once more, now mixed with whispers and gasps. The truth had been revealed. Appearances, no matter how carefully crafted, meant nothing. What mattered in the end was the man who sat before them, a man whose presence was undeniable, whose power was quietly felt but never flaunted. And as Emma retreated, realizing her mistake, the rest of the restaurant resumed their business. But the moment had changed something in the air. Shaquille O'Neal had just proven, in a way that could not be denied, that sometimes the most important truths come when no one expects them. Emma had worked at La Lumiere for several years, and in that time, she had come to view herself as more than just a waitress. To her, she was a guardian of the restaurant's reputation, a self-appointed arbiter of its exclusivity and refinement. La Lumiere wasn't just a place to eat. It was a sanctuary of elegance, a temple of high society. Every detail, from the starched linen napkins to the delicate crystal stemware, had to align with a certain standard. It was a place where the elite came to dine, to see, and be seen. Emma believed she played a crucial role in maintaining that image. She had seen the world of wealth and status through a unique lens. Being a waitress, she was privy to the nuances of power and privilege. She knew who the regulars were: old money with impeccable taste, celebrities with stylists in tow, and foreign dignitaries who wore their wealth like an aura. These were the people who belonged here. They understood the unspoken rules of decorum, of how to dress, how to behave, and those who didn't fit the mold, they stood out in all the wrong ways. So when Emma's eyes landed on Shaquille O'Neal, she couldn't hide her displeasure. He didn't belong here. The man was a giant, not just physically, but in every sense of the word. His towering frame seemed to dwarf the plush surroundings of the restaurant. And the clothes, the worn-out sneakers, the faded t-shirt. It was an affront to the place she so carefully curated. Someone like this doesn't belong here, she thought, scanning him with a judgmental gaze. The other guests will notice. He's a distraction. Her mind quickly began to categorize him. A former athlete, perhaps a bit washed up, trying to relive the glory days in a place where he clearly didn't fit. This wasn't the type of customer she was used to dealing with. She couldn't fathom that someone of his stature, both physically and in fame, would come into a place like La Lumiere without knowing the proper decorum. As Shaquille approached the hostess stand, his deep voice interrupted her judgmental musings. "Good evening," he said, his tone calm and surprisingly warm, a stark contrast to the sharpness she had expected. "I'd like to book a table if there's one available." Emma blinked, momentarily taken aback by his politeness. Her usual rehearsed routine of scrutinizing and rejecting was interrupted by his gentle demeanor. She paused, momentarily reconsidering her approach. But only for a brief moment. She quickly regained her air of superiority, lifting her chin slightly as she scanned him again, this time more deliberately, as if measuring his worth. "This is a fine dining establishment," she said, her words dripping with condescension. She placed a hand on the reservation book as though it were a sacred text, giving the impression that his request might be an inconvenience to her, to the restaurant, even to the very concept of exclusivity. "Are you sure you want to eat here?" she added, her tone sharp, almost biting. The question wasn't an inquiry. It was a statement veiled in the form of a question, a challenge. She was testing him, gauging his response. It was as though she wanted to see if he understood the weight of the place he was stepping into, if he could grasp the gravity of dining in such a rarefied space. Shaquille, however, wasn't flustered. His expression remained calm, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He could feel the judgment seeping from Emma's words, but it didn't bother him. He was used to people assuming things about him based on his appearance, but that had never defined him. The notion of belonging wasn't something he'd ever sought out. It was a luxury, not a necessity. He had built a life around authenticity, not appearances. "I'm sure," he said simply, his voice unwavering. "I know what kind of restaurant this is, and I'm here to enjoy a good meal, not to impress anyone." Emma's brow furrowed slightly, and for a moment she hesitated. She was trained to maintain the standards of La Luminaire, and this interaction was quickly testing her patience. But there was something about his confidence, his calmness, that left her speechless. It wasn't the response she expected. He wasn't pleading for a seat or trying to prove anything. He just seemed so unaffected. For a moment, Emma considered turning him away, but she couldn't do it. Not in front of the other guests. Not when the weight of her judgment felt like it might crumble in the face of someone so sure of himself. So, after a beat of silence, she reluctantly opened the reservation book. She jotted down his name, Shaquille O'Neal, and her fingers hesitated as they hovered over the list of available tables. "Follow me," she said, her tone now lacking the earlier venom but still carrying a hint of reluctance. She led him through the restaurant, past tables where diners whispered amongst themselves, casting curious glances toward the giant walking among them. Some whispered in awe, others in disbelief. As she escorted him to a quiet corner, Emma couldn't help but notice how effortlessly Shaquille moved through the space, as if he belonged here just as much as any other patron, maybe more. He wasn't the one trying to fit in. He was already larger than the expectations she had set for him. She placed the menu in front of him, still grappling with the fact that someone like Shaquille O'Neal, someone so seemingly out of place, was sitting at a table she had deemed appropriate. And for the first time in years, Emma found herself questioning the very standards she had spent so much of her life upholding. Was she the gatekeeper, or was she the one standing on the other side, judging others for things she hadn't even begun to understand? Unfazed by Emma's attitude, Shaquille O'Neal met her gaze squarely, his eyes steady and unwavering. "Yes, I'd like to try dining here," he said, his voice calm and composed, cutting through the tension in the air. It wasn't the response Emma had expected. His words lacked the nervousness or meekness she anticipated from someone in his position. Instead, there was a quiet confidence in them, as if he were already sure of his place, even in a space so foreign to him. Emma rolled her eyes but quickly masked the gesture with an expression of professionalism. She was well practiced in keeping her emotions in check, especially in front of customers, no matter how much they grated on her. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked briskly away, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She moved toward the reservation desk, her mind already plotting her next move. "This guy isn't going to last long here," she thought, shaking her head as she retrieved the reservation book. "Let's see how he reacts when he sees the menu prices." In her mind, the high-end prices were the ultimate test. No matter how famous or wealthy a person was, the exorbitant costs at La Lumiere always seemed to make people pause. She was certain he would flinch when faced with a $200 0-cents appetizer or a $500 0-cents bottle of wine. As most did, it would expose him for what he was in her eyes, out of place and most likely out of his depth. Meanwhile, Shaquille, though acutely aware of Emma's judgment, remained unfazed. In his years on the basketball court, he had faced pressure from every angle: critics, crowds, expectations, and had learned to maintain an inner stillness amidst chaos. La Lumiere, with all its gleaming surfaces and high society pretense, was no different. To him, this was just another challenge, albeit a subtler one. He took in the lavish ambiance of the restaurant, his large frame almost blending into the background as he observed the other patrons. The golden light from the chandeliers bathed his face, illuminating the calm and confident gaze that never wavered. Every detail around him, from the intricate paintings on the walls to the sleek, polished floors, spoke of money and status. But none of it fazed him. He had seen wealth on a different scale. He had played in arenas where the stakes were far higher, where judgment came not in glances, but in how well he performed when it counted. This world, with its carefully crafted boundaries and rigid expectations, was a far cry from the one he had known, yet there was a certain irony in it all. Shaquille wasn't here to prove anything. He had already achieved what most could only dream of. but he had never felt the need to conform to the ideals of others. What intrigued him was the challenge. How far could he push the world's prejudices? How much could he reveal without ever needing to speak a word? As Shaquille sat back in his seat, the hum of conversation continued around him, but it was as though the rest of the room faded into the background. His eyes lingered on the silver cutlery, the intricate folds of the tablecloth, the quiet elegance that seemed to define La Lumière. But all of it felt secondary. The true test was not about the food, the setting, or the perception others had of him. It was about confronting the very system that sought to define who belonged and who did not. He was here, not to dominate, but to challenge. He wanted to see how deep the prejudice ran, how rigid the walls of this world really were. Was it truly a place where the worth of a person could be measured by the labels on their clothing or the number on their bank account? Or could a man like him, someone who had never adhered to society's expectations, stand at the center of it all and expose the cracks in their carefully constructed facade? He wasn't angry. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was simply about to test the limits of the world around him in his own way. And as Emma returned with the menu, her expression a mix of skepticism and curiosity, Shaquille knew that this was only the beginning. What he did next would not only challenge her assumptions, but might very well change the way everyone in this room saw the world. The stakes, for him, were more than just a meal. They were about revealing a truth that so many preferred to keep hidden, that the walls people build around themselves are often made of nothing more than invisible prejudices. Emma returned to Shaquille's table with a renewed sense of purpose, her steps sharp and deliberate. There was no mistaking the barely concealed arrogance in her demeanor as she approached. She had a reputation to uphold, after all, and she was determined to make this moment a lesson for Shaq and anyone else watching. "This spot should match your style perfectly," she said with a thin smile, her words oozing with passive-aggressive charm. She gestured toward a dimly lit table tucked near the kitchen, where the sounds of clattering dishes, sizzling pans, and the faint aroma of garlic and onions filled the air. It was a stark contrast to the elegant, quieter sections of the restaurant, where high-profile patrons were seated in plush booths with ample space and soft lighting. The kitchen area, on the other hand, was noisy and chaotic, the last place someone seeking a sophisticated dining experience would want to sit. Shaquille didn't flinch. He simply nodded, acknowledging the seat without reacting to the obvious slight. His smile remained unwavering, a silent reflection of his confidence and composure. He knew exactly what Emma was trying to do. The subtle jab wasn't lost on him. He'd been through much more difficult tests in his life, and this was no different. Emma's lips curled into a tight, self-satisfied smile as she watched him settle into the seat. She dropped the menu onto the table with a light thud, loud enough to draw attention from nearby diners. The sound echoed through the room, a sharp contrast to the otherwise quiet murmurs of conversation. It was as though she wanted everyone to hear the message. This is where you belong. This is your place. Shaquille made no move to pick up the menu. Instead, he sat back, his gaze never leaving Emma's. She could feel the weight of his stare, though she refused to acknowledge the shift in the atmosphere. He wasn't reacting the way she thought he would. "Hope you enjoy this spot," she said, her voice raised slightly, loud enough for the nearby diners to overhear. "Not everyone gets such a prime seat," she added with a thin, almost mocking laugh. The words hung in the air like a challenge, but instead of embarrassment or frustration, Shaquille simply smiled again. He wasn't upset, he wasn't even bothered, but the shift in the room was palpable. A subtle ripple passed through the other patrons, who began whispering amongst themselves. Some cast sympathetic glances toward Shaquille, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and pity, as though they could feel the awkwardness of his position. Others, perhaps more familiar with La Lumière's reputation for exclusivity, watched with silent judgment. Emma, feeling the weight of their gazes, stood a little straighter, trying to maintain her composure as the tension in the room subtly rose. She had expected Shaquille to be the one to squirm, to try to salvage his dignity, but instead, it was she who felt the uncomfortable shift. Her little display of power seemed to be backfiring. She had expected the towering figure in front of her to shrink, or to argue, to plead for a better table, but instead, Shaquille's calm demeanor was throwing her off balance. Shaquille could sense the change in the atmosphere. He could feel the eyes on him, the murmurs, the curiosity. It didn't faze him. If anything, it amused him. This wasn't the first time he had been tested in this way. Throughout his career, he had faced countless challenges both on and off the court. People questioning his worth, his talents, and his place in a world that constantly tried to categorize him. He had learned to stay steady, to remain unshaken by the judgments of others. He had stepped into this restaurant expecting something like this, a challenge of perception, a test of how others saw him, and now he was ready to take it on in his own way. As Emma stood there, awaiting some kind of response, Shaquille's smile never wavered. "Thank you, Emma," he said simply, his voice steady and calm. "I'm sure this spot will be just fine." She looked at him for a moment, searching for a crack in his composure, but found none. His words were casual, unbothered, as if he were commenting on the weather. And it was this unflinching calmness, this refusal to react the way she expected, that seemed to unsettle her the most. Turning on her heel, Emma walked away, leaving Shaquille alone at the table. The whispers around him didn't stop, but now they had a different tone. Some of the diners, who once looked at him with judgment or curiosity, began to exchange glances, ones that hinted at respect, or at least a growing realization that this wasn't just a man to be dismissed easily. Shaquille, on the other hand, sat back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't here for approval. He wasn't here to be accepted. He was here to make one thing clear. Appearances didn't define him, and no amount of dismissive gestures from someone like Emma could shake him from his place at the table. He wasn't the one who needed to prove anything. The challenge, after all, wasn't about him fitting into this world. It was about seeing how far the world would bend to accommodate him. And for now, at least, he was content to let the challenge unfold. As Shaquille O'Neal sank into the plush chair, the weight of the room's eyes immediately settled on him. He could feel the judgment, the curiosity, the whispers that danced in the air like a slow-moving tide. But he remained unbothered. His eyes were steady as he picked up the menu, flipping through the pages with the calmness of a man who was no stranger to being scrutinized. Emma, still determined to make him uncomfortable, leaned in toward him, her expression tightly controlled but dripping with mockery. "Would you like me to explain the prices?" she asked, her voice laced with thinly veiled disdain. She pointed to the corner of the menu, where the restaurant's most luxurious dish was listed, the Caviar Imperial, a delicacy that carried a hefty $350.00 price tag. Her eyes searched his face, waiting for a sign of surprise or discomfort, a clue that he might balk at the price. She was confident she'd find it. But Shaquille's reaction was far from what Emma had anticipated. His gaze remained unwavering as he scanned the menu, unfazed by her pointed gesture. He wasn't there to play her game, nor was he interested in the price tag that came with the food. He was here for the experience, not the theatrics. His voice was calm, as steady as a rock. "I'll have the filet mignon Rossini," he said, his tone unflinching, as though he were ordering the simplest dish on the menu, not something that would easily surpass $100.00. The dish was rich, indulgent, a perfectly seared filet mignon topped with foie gras, truffles, and a luxurious demi-glace. It was without a doubt one of the restaurant's most expensive items, but Shaquille didn't feel the need to emphasize the grandeur of his choice. Emma faltered for just a moment, surprised that he hadn't been shaken by her attempt to unsettle him, but she quickly recovered, a derisive laugh escaping her lips. It was clear she hadn't expected him to take her bait. "Oh, really?" she said, with a forced chuckle, raising an eyebrow. "I hope you know how to appreciate it. This isn't the kind of food that everyone is accustomed to." Her words were sharp, filled with an edge of superiority. She was trying to remind him that this wasn't just about the price, it was about belonging. And, in her eyes, Shaquille didn't belong here, no matter how much money he could throw around. Shaquille met her eyes, his expression remaining unchanged, the faintest hint of amusement in his gaze. It was a small smile, one that spoke volumes more than any words could. He wasn't interested in defending his choice or justifying himself. He was simply there to enjoy the meal, unaffected by her attempt to provoke him. Emma's words bounced off him, like water off a duck's back. In the silence that followed, Emma quickly turned away, her sharp heels clicking against the floor as she walked off, likely to place the order in the kitchen. But even as she disappeared into the back, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't quite won this round. Shaquille O'Neal had entered her world and remained unflinching, a presence that seemed to tower over the discomfort she'd tried to impose. As Emma turned to walk away, the buzz in the restaurant grew noticeably louder. Nearby diners, having witnessed the tension between her and Shaquille, began to whisper among themselves. Some looked at Shaq with sympathetic glances, others with curiosity, but all seemed aware of the sharpness that had just transpired. They were unsettled by Emma's rudeness, and a quiet murmur began to ripple through the room, the whispers of judgment and surprise weaving into the elegant ambiance. Shaquille, however, remained composed. He didn't react to the stares or the quiet conversations about him. He simply leaned back in his chair, placing his hands casually on the table. With a gentle nod, he thanked Emma for her suggestion and expressed his genuine anticipation for the meal. His calm demeanor only highlighted the contrast between him and the tense energy around him. Emma, walking away, could feel her irritation growing. She had expected Shaquille to buckle under her comments, but instead he had done the opposite. He'd remained unshaken, unbothered, and even polite. As she reached the corner, she muttered just loud enough for nearby patrons to hear, "People like that usually pick expensive items just to look fancy, but wait till the check comes. I bet he'll leave right away." Her words hung in the air like an attempt to further prove her point, but it only seemed to make the atmosphere more charged. Despite the increasing tension, Shaquille stayed in his own world, savoring the experience as if it were just another moment in a lifetime of challenges. He embodied a sense of calmness that was contagious, refusing to let the whispers or the judgment affect his mood. As the restaurant's energy shifted around him, he remained resolute, unmoved, unbothered, and utterly in control of his own moment. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in La Lumiere grew increasingly tense. Shaquille O'Neal, seated at his table, had become the focal point of attention, not for his towering height, but for the calm dignity he maintained in the face of Emma's disdain. The murmurs among the diners intensified, a collective acknowledgement of the unfair treatment he had endured. Emma, still intent on making Shaq uncomfortable, continued to hover around his table, her demeanor dripping with condescension. "You know," she said, her voice loud enough for nearby diners to hear, "not everyone can appreciate fine dining. Some people just come here to pretend." Her words were laced with mockery, but Shaq remained unfazed, his expression steady and composed. Nearby patrons exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disapproval of Emma's behavior. A young woman named Lisa, seated at a neighboring table, leaned toward her companion. "She's being so rude. He hasn't done anything to deserve this treatment," she whispered, her voice filled with indignation. Her friend nodded in agreement, his eyes fixed on Shaq, who continued to enjoy his meal with an air of quiet confidence. As Emma walked past Shaq's table once more, she deliberately turned her back and spoke loudly enough for others to hear. "Some people just don't understand that not everyone belongs here. It's amusing to watch how hard they try to fit in." Her words were a thinly veiled jab at Shaq, but he remained unbothered, his calm demeanor only serving to heighten the tension in the room. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, an older couple seated at a central table, observed the unfolding drama with growing concern. Mr. Carter, a distinguished man with silver hair, leaned toward his wife. "This is disgraceful." "She's clearly trying to humiliate him," he murmured, his voice laced with indignation. Mrs. Carter nodded, her expression reflecting empathy for Shaq. "We should report her to the manager," she suggested, her eyes darting toward Emma, who was now engaged in conversation with another table, seemingly oblivious to the discontent brewing around her. As the minutes ticked by, Shaq remained seated, his demeanor unshaken. He occasionally glanced at the paintings on the walls or the sparkling chandelier overhead, savoring the ambiance of the restaurant. Yet the tension in the air was palpable, a taut string waiting to snap. Emma, still determined to assert her perceived superiority, continued to ignore Shaq, focusing instead on other tables, her laughter ringing hollow in the quiet space. The murmurs of the diners grew louder, and the atmosphere shifted from one of formal elegance to an uneasy tension. Shaq, seated in the most inconspicuous corner, had become the center of attention, not for any grand display, but for the quiet strength he embodied. He was a man who had faced fierce competitors on the basketball court, and now he was facing a different kind of challenge, one that required patience and grace. As Emma continued her performance, the restaurant staff began to take notice. Jake, a young man with a kind face, exchanged worried glances with his colleagues. "This isn't right," he whispered to a fellow server, his discomfort evident. "We should do something." But the moment of intervention had not yet arrived. The tension hung in the air, thick and charged, as Shaq remained calm, embodying the very lesson that was about to unfold. The night was far from over, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge not only Emma's behavior, but the very values that La Lumiere stood for. As the evening progressed, the tension in La Lumiere reached a boiling point. Shaquille O'Neal, still seated at his table, had become the center of attention, not for his towering stature, but for the calm dignity he exuded in the face of Emma's disdain. The murmurs among the diners grew louder, a collective acknowledgement of the unfair treatment he had endured. Finally, the restaurant manager, Mr. Thompson, emerged from the back, his expression a mix of concern and respect. He approached Shaq's table, bowing slightly. "Shaq, it's such an honor to have you here. I apologize for the delay. We had no idea you were coming today." The room fell silent, all eyes now fixed on the basketball legend. Emma stood frozen, her confidence shattered as the realization of who Shaq truly was washed over her. The whispers of admiration and astonishment rippled through the restaurant, and she felt the weight of judgment from every corner. Shaq, however, remained composed, his demeanor unshaken. With a gentle yet firm voice, Shaq addressed the room. This restaurant was founded to welcome everyone, no matter what they look like or where they come from. Unfortunately, today we failed to uphold that belief. His words resonated deeply, awakening a sense of accountability among the diners and staff alike. As he continued, Shaq emphasized the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their appearance or status. "We all make mistakes," he said, his gaze steady on Emma, "but what matters is what we learn from them." The atmosphere shifted, and a newfound understanding began to blossom among the patrons. After the last diners left, the staff gathered around Shaq, forming a circle. He spoke to them with sincerity, urging them to create a welcoming environment for all. Emma, standing at the edge, felt the weight of his words penetrate her heart. She realized that this was not just a lesson for her, but for everyone present. As Shaq concluded, he looked directly at Emma. "Change is a process, and I believe you can do it if you truly want to." In that moment, she felt a flicker of hope ignite within her, a chance to grow and become better. As Shaquille O'Neal stepped out of La Lumiere, the night air enveloped him, and the lights of Beverly Hills twinkled in the distance. He reflected on the evening's events, knowing that the lessons shared within those walls extended far beyond the restaurant. It was a reminder that kindness, respect, and understanding should be the foundation of every interaction. In the days that followed, Emma embraced her commitment to change, striving to treat every guest with the dignity they deserved. The story of La Lumiere became a powerful testament to the impact of compassion and the importance of seeing beyond appearances. Shaq's presence had not only challenged the prejudices within the restaurant, but had also inspired a ripple effect of kindness that would resonate throughout the community. As the world continued to turn, the lesson learned that night remained etched in the hearts of all who witnessed it. True strength lies not in judgment, but in acceptance, and every small act of kindness has the power to change lives. What do you think about tonight's lesson? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a similar situation where kindness and understanding shattered prejudice? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share it to spread the message, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on more meaningful stories. See you in the next video.